Hello, everyone. My name is Adriane Kuzminski, and today I would like to talk to you about interacting with sound, creating accessible, engaging gameplay. So accessible, engaging. What do those words really mean when it comes to sound design? Well, let me start off with a quick story. Back in 2013, I was walking the show floor at PAX East, and I came across a booth for the Able Gamers charity. There I spoke with Mark Bartlett, Steve Spahn, and Craig Kaufman, who explained how games need to be more accessible to people with disabilities. I was taken aback. I had never thought about gaming with a disability. So after the show, I did a little research. I learned about how colorblind filters and closed captioning were becoming the standards in video games and making a huge difference for gamers. I also learned about the accessible controllers that were available, which have since been succeeded by Microsoft's own adaptive controller for Xbox One. But of course, I'm a sound designer, so naturally I wanted to know what games were accessible with their audio for blind gamers. That's when I started to see the gap. I went to audiogames.net, which is a website specifically geared towards gamers with visual impairments. And I tried out several audio-only games. These were games that brought people together who were generally ignored by the industry and even many game accessibility advocates at the time. And these games also encourage gamers with visual impairments to learn to code themselves, as they were often developed in Python. However, because tools used for audio production and game development were at the early stages of their accessibility, and have since vastly improved, the soundscapes in these games weren't always engaging. They were accessible, but they didn't really suck me in. There were some standouts, like Swamp and Entombed, which had not only immersive audio, they were also engaging first-person shooters and turn-based strategy games. But the gap was still there. These games were made specifically for blind gamers, while just about every other game was made for sighted players. And I didn't think it had to be this way. Luckily, neither did many others. Meet Brandon Cole, Sightless Combat, and Thomas Torek. These guys are gamers with visual impairments who started off by playing just about any game they could get their hands on, and they let people know about it and what challenges they faced. Thomas did this by starting a thread to compile all mainstream games that he and others were able to play, even if the developers never intended their games to be blind accessible. Brandon gets the word out with his blog, which he has been writing for years. He not only talks about accessibility, but also representation of blind characters in games and the state of accessibility on consoles. He's also spoken at GDC, the Game Accessibility Conference, accessibility boot camps for Microsoft and Sony, and he has visited developers in their studios. There's also Sightless, who has most recently written a report about the state of blind accessibility in games while attending E3. This report was created for the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, and it covers companies like Nintendo, Microsoft, Sony, Valve, and others. He too has spoken at the Game Accessibility Conference and Microsoft's Gaming and Disability Bootcamp, and he has visited several studios. And there are many others, like Carlos Vasquez, who competed at EVO 2013 and spoke to Hector Sanchez from NetherRealm about how he played fighting games and the barriers that he faced. Carlos was able to relay in their conversation that in Injustice: Gods Among Us, he was held back from competing because when players could interact with seen objects, the notification was only visual. Soon after, NetherRealm included an audible notification, and all it took was that one sound to vastly improve the gameplay experience for blind competitors. And the community is only growing, not only in players, but also a number of blind gamers who stream on Twitch and YouTube. Plus, there are several game studios that have launched to make games playable by both blind and sighted players. Even developers like Turn 10 Studios have shown great interest in accessibility, with their praise of accessibility roles at other companies, and the inclusion of accessibility as a major part of an audio role, which they recently hired. So what does this all mean for you and your studio? Why should you care about blind gamers? For me personally, I care because there are blind accessible solutions for almost every other type of media. For books, we have audiobooks and screen readers. For television and film, we have audio description. And for interactive media like the internet, we have screen readers and standards like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I believe games are just as important as these other media, and that they can express the human experience just as beautifully. So why should we ignore games? Well, if your bottom line is more your concern, then take this into consideration. There are over 285 million people who are visually impaired. We have an ever-growing population of aging gamers who are at risk of losing their vision. And blind accessibility can help people with no visual impairments at all, like people who struggle with text from dyslexia or because they are learning a new language. There's also growing research into the effect of audio on people with sensory processing disorders and autism. You can even look outside of accessibility to find uses for blind accessible audio. Car audio is emerging into the game space with eyes-free, hands-free gaming. And if we look at some of the current challenges in VR, like subtitles and motion sickness, we could consider offloading some of this visual strain with audio solutions. So now we understand the who and the why, but what about the how? Accessible, engaging. How do we create audio that communicates sometimes dry gameplay information while still being immersive? Luckily, we are not the first ones to ask this question. User experience designers have been creating immersive, accessible experiences for everything from web pages to physical products. Sure, they primarily deal more with the visual aspects, but we can learn a lot from them. In my last talk for Games SoundCon, I spoke about how sound designers can find inspiration from user interface design, but this time I'd like to focus more on user experience design, which can help us create accessible and engaging user-focused audio. So let's take a look at personas. No, not that persona. Personas help us look at the features we need by understanding the tasks, behaviors, and attitudes of our users. They help us examine what we expect of users and what users expect of our games with storytelling. There's a great quote, which is, "When you hear someone might want this, you know you're about to hear a really bad design decision." This is a quote by Alan Cooper, who, among many other things, pioneered the use of personas in interaction design. I want everyone to keep it in mind. It can be easy to get sucked into the design rabbit holes when trying to understand the needs of others who you may not relate to. And misled guesswork can greatly take up your limited time, money, and especially energy. Instead, creating personas can help us understand and remember how people approach our games with their different experiences and goals. Let's take a look at a couple examples. Meet Wyatt. She is a gamer with dyslexia who likes to play story-rich games. To be immersed, she likes to delve into all the lore, which is why some of her favorite games are from the Fallout and Elder Scrolls series. However, though she has no issues with her sight, she can hardly get through a few pages in the books in Skyrim because of their hard-to-read fonts. Wyatt's desires are pretty straightforward. She wants to be able to access written in-game audio, in-game stories without having to leave the game to go online and listen to the stories read by YouTubers, which, yes, does exist. Now meet Ted. Ted grew up playing Nintendo games like Dr. Mario and NHL 96, but by his early 20s, he was legally blind. Now he has children, and he recently bought them a Wii U, which reignited his own interest in games. His son Jalen is especially fond of games, but he is sensitive to certain sounds because of his sensory processing disorder. Ted wants to be able to play games without having to get up and stand close to the screen to read the menus. He wants to be able to teach his kids good TV viewing habits, and also they like to sit on his lap while they play. Since he's more of a passive player, he doesn't mind giving his kids the controller when he gets stuck on a scene that may be inaccessible. And though he has memorized menus and games that they play the most, he doesn't particularly enjoy doing this. Finally, meet Jasmine. Since Jasmine was born, she has only been able to see small amounts of light, not shapes and especially not text. She first started to play games as a teen on Xbox One using Copilot with her sister. They would play Halo 5 together. She would control the weapons, and her sister would handle all the movement. When her family subscribed to Game Pass, she experimented with just about every game available, eventually discovered Injustice, which inspired her to try out other fighting games, like Skullgirls, on her laptop using her screen reader. For Jasmine, she likes to play with her sister, but she also wants to be able to play by herself once in a while. She wishes she could play more strategy games, as she's a fan of Pandemic and Munchkins, and she wants to be able to play games in their entirety without having to ask her family for help. She has no problems memorizing menus, or looking up controller schemes online, or even memorizing entire maps. She also wishes QuickTime events were audible, so she could take up the challenge herself. Now that we've gotten to know our audience a little bit, let's introduce a prototype. Luckily, I have one available. Last year, I looked into how I could make a tower defense game blind accessible. I used the Tower Defense 2D template for Unity, which was created by the developer Good Day, and did my best to make it playable without sight. It's not perfect, but I learned a lot. Let's take a quick look at the first level.
Tower Defense 2D. Press spacebar to begin. Assignment. Press spacebar to select, or press the arrow keys to find a level. Level 1, Level 2, Level 3, Level 2, Level 1. Assignment. It is time, young commander, to prove your skills. The beasts of Dievler have planned a series of attacks to avenge their ancestors. And for our mystic neighbors, the Free Eldir, it couldn't be a Level 1. Press spacebar to begin battle. Press enter at any time for more options. The beasts are on their way, and you have only 25 gold to start hiring mercenaries. You will earn more gold as you attack the enemies. There are 6 defending towers available. To open the tower menu, press T. Use the arrow keys to toggle through the towers, and press spacebar to select a tower. Then, to choose a mercenary. Tower 1, Tower 2, Tower 3, Tower 4, Tower 5, Tower 6, Tower 1. Archer 5 gold. Tower 1, Tower 2, Archer 5 gold, Wizard 6, Soldier 4 gold. Tower 1, Tower 6, Tower 5, Tower 4, Archer 5 gold, Ballista 50, Cannon 10 gold. Tower 1, Tower 6, Tower 5, Tower 6, Archer 5 gold, Ballista 50. 14 remaining gold. 11 remaining enemies. Tower 1, Tower 6, Archer 5 gold, Ballista 15 gold.
So like I said, it's not perfect, but when planning the audio for this prototype, the first thing I had to do was ask myself, what must I have to meet the needs of my intended audience? Let's take a look again at Wyatt and what she needs. Since Wyatt only struggles with long paragraphs of text, we can ask ourselves, can we make the text audible? But this question goes a little deeper. We could use voice actors, or we could use a text-to-speech engine. Now, there has been some debate about including screen readers versus voice actors. My belief is that we should utilize them both. And perhaps you're thinking, screen readers, they're really annoying. Well, yes, maybe if you don't use them on a regular basis, but for people who use them every day, they can be just as immersive as when you settle into a good book. Also, there are benefits of screen readers that I think are often overlooked. Many people comprehend their screen readers at very high speeds. I myself use them to quickly read academic material or when I want to give my eyes a rest. But even with my passive use, I actually think that the pace in the demo I showed you was pretty slow. And for people who listen to screen readers on a regular basis, their speed sounds more like this.
Well, let me just read a few more. Gives me the website. It says it takes 55 minutes. And it's telling me a little bit about it, like that, you know, all ages can enjoy this. Recipes, Toll House. Okay, so this one's soft and chewy. I like my cookies soft, so I think I want to click on this one to see what it is.
And I've heard screen readers even faster than this. And at these fast paces, players are not slowed down any more than those who are reading the text. Also, screen readers are starting to sound more natural than ever, and users can control the voice that they want to identify with. You can also use them to prototype your dialogue. However, though there are now screen readers on consoles, they don't quite work in-game yet. And the main thing is that in the end, you should always test with blind gamers in person to see how they interact with technology.
Well, let me just read a few.
Getting back to Wyatt, I would prefer that the storyline and tower defense demo that I showed you was read by a voice actor. After all, it's hard to think of games, say like the Stanley Parable or Thomas Was Alone, thinking about those games without their narrators. But in the case of your game, if you have, say, 455 books that you want to have audible, and you can't find your budget to support 360,000 more words of dialogue, perhaps your users of all abilities could get used to screen readers like this.
I write this volume in the desperate hope that the rest of Tamriel can come to know my people as they deserve to be known, and understand this province for what it truly is, a place of uncontested beauty and culture.
So in the end, this helps gamers at least be able to access the information. So let's move on to the next persona. For Ted, we have some of the same concerns when balancing screen readers and voice actors. However, for Ted, his needs include all text, including menus that need to be spoken, which won't be a problem as long as he's a PC user. He also prefers audio sliders, not only so he can hear dialogue clearly, but also to help his son Jalen concentrate. As I said before, the role of audio with sensory processing disorders and autism is young. It seems that the most distracting sounds for people with SPD come from certain frequency ranges, or their unexpected nature, or if they have a lack of meaning. And there are therapies that deal with removing and reintroducing distracting sounds. The best thing you can do for now is make sure that you cover the basics with sliders for music, voiceover, ambience, and even the user interface if you can swing it, especially if you have a game that requires a lot of concentration. Finally, we have Jasmine. Not only does she need all text to be accessible with audio, she also needs all icon and movements in the game to have sounds too, which can quickly overload a player if you don't create a hierarchy of importance. So we must ask ourselves, what sounds are most important to Jasmine? First, in the tower defense demo, it is important that she knows where the enemies are coming from and where they are going. This is handled by panning the enemy's footsteps from the left to the right as they cross the battlefield. The footsteps are also ducked low in the mix at the beginning, since the player already knows they've arrived from their growls. As the enemies go along the map, their footsteps get louder and are panned more harshly on the right side to make them stand out from the mix. This notifies the player that they need to strengthen their right side towers. And to top it off, the enemies blow a battle horn, panned to the right, at a spot on the map that still gives players time to defend their final positions. Other information that is important to know is when her defenders or the enemies are killed during the battle. So all death and injury sounds are panned to their location on the map. She also needs to know when the hordes first arrive, and in this case, the enemies come in groups of 3 for each wave. Then they all growl together with their distinct voices, giving the player some indication of who has arrived. And if I were to make an adjustment, I would also add some musical stingers to each wave to make it more dramatic, and perhaps maybe a little less annoying than how it currently is. Though she can tell when the enemies are dying, it's also important for her to know how many enemies are left on the battlefield. She could estimate this from the rumble of the footsteps, but I think it's important for her to have an exact count so she can play strategically. Instead of having the game tell her periodically how many enemies remain, which would only distract her from what she was currently focusing on, Jasmine instead has a hotkey to find out how many enemies are left, whenever she wants. She can also use another hotkey to find out how much gold she has left. And if she attempts to purchase a defender without enough gold, an angry male choir yells. A sound I'm not completely sold on, but it does the job for now. While hotkeys are great, it is important that we don't abuse them and demand that Jasmine spend several minutes memorizing all these controls before starting the game. You could follow control schemes that are used in other audio games, but mainly we want to make sure that she understands the basics and how to access the help menu. This is done in the demo by using a consistent control scheme, using the arrow keys for direction, the spacebar to select, enter for help, and escape to leave, along with the two aforementioned hotkeys and T to open the tower menu. The navigation controls are repeated throughout the opening menus to help her pick up on the pattern before she begins. She's also told how to access the help menu before the level starts. It is here where she can learn the 3 hotkeys. If I were to make another adjustment, I'd also consider a quick step-by-step tutorial before starting the level. Finally, it is important Jasmine can move around the map and select her defenders quickly. This is facilitated by a few things. First, she is able to interrupt the screen reader at any time, and she can choose the speed of the screen reader. She is also told the most important terms first, so she doesn't have to wait on unnecessary wordiness. I'd even suggest changing the words Tower 1 to First Tower, which could even help her save more time. Finally, though it wasn't implemented in the video, Jasmine may also prefer that the backstory be delivered by a compelling voice actor instead of the screen reader. So we've looked at our personas and our prototype. Let's see if we can find some guidelines to keep in mind for future games. I grouped these points into speed, flexibility, memory load, notifications and reinforcement, and emotion and storytelling. Speed is incredibly important, as we all know, especially for blind gamers who depend on audio. If there's an unexpected delay, you can completely lose the feel of the gameplay. And if you have to wait for a sound to finish playing before you are able to take any action, that can kill the feel too. Sounds that are long and can't be interrupted can also distract gamers, along with wordy dialogue. So make sure to use key terms first. For dialogue, you can consider doing this in a more natural way by mimicking conversational dialogue. And when it comes to sound effects that are frequently interrupted by players, consider shortening or ducking these sounds. But if they are rare and more gratifying, then they can last a little bit longer, like one of my favorite sounds from Fallout New Vegas. Just love that sound. Expanding on speed is flexibility, which we've covered quite a bit already. Essentially, you just need to allow your players to choose the speed of their screen reader, or maybe in the future, dialogue itself, and provide sliders so they can choose what audio information they like to prioritize. Now, when it comes to working memory, this is essentially the next step when information from the sensory memory has been reinforced. This info is meant to be memorized long enough so players don't need to actively recall each time they hear a sound. One way of expediting info to the working memory is to make sure you don't demand too much is memorized all at once. This can be achieved with pacing, like tutorials, or by using sounds familiar to the player's past experiences. Familiarization is incredibly important when it comes to minimizing memory load. Just like how we can look at certain icons, like a magnifying glass, and know that it represents a search function, audio can use references in the same way. Coin sounds often represent money, and in the game Frequency Missing, items and people were iconized by the sounds of their movements, like a jiggling doorknob, or scribbling pencils, or rattling boxes. You can also see if there are patterns that already exist in your game's genre. Though I doubt we'll ever see standard sounds similar to how icons are used in user interfaces. In this case, it's important to create a logical, consistent, and predictable pattern. For example, listen to the sounds in Bejeweled Stars. Even in that very short clip, there's a lot going on. They used repetition and one sound, one function to help players memorize abstract sounds. Dialogue can also help minimize memory load. In the tower defense demo, I alternated between sound effects and dialogue, using sound effects when players are likely to be sure of their actions, such as when they select a menu option, and dialogue when there's a chance they may have made a mistake, such as with hotkeys. Dialogue is also crucial when players need help, which they should be able to access at any time. You can even weigh the strain on your player's memory load by categorizing your sounds. For example, in the tower defense demo, players have to memorize the functions of the arrow keys, enter, spacebar, escape, and the T, E, and G keys. Two sounds that also need to be memorized are when the player successfully purchases a defender and when they are out of gold. Since these sounds are not clear enough to be understood outside the context of the gameplay, they require a little bit more memorization, and that's something I would prefer to clear up. And for the sounds that are relatively familiar, these could be recognized on sensory memory alone, which are footsteps, enemy and defender injuries and deaths, and the battle horn indicating the enemy is near the end. And when it comes to precise information, this was left to the dialogue. This includes the defender and tower selections, the number of enemies remaining, and the gold accrued. These were also followed by quick sound effects to confirm their action. When it comes to notifications and reinforcements, most informational sounds fall under one of these two categories. If a player needs to know a zombie horde is on its way, they should hear that zombie horde coming. If they pull the trigger to shoot a zombie, the gun should fire. If their health is low, they should hear struggle breathing or a louder heartbeat. These are just some of the ways that we inform players and reinforce their actions. Just as we don't want to demand too high of a memory load, we also don't want to overdo it with notifications. Low health would be important to know right away, but perhaps a player doesn't need a sound to know when they need to reload. Just as with the hotkeys in the demo, it's important to figure out what sound should be initiated by the game and what sound should be initiated by the player. Of these sounds, it's also important to know what should be prioritized in the mix. How common is the sound? If it's not clearly heard, would it affect the gameplay? How gratifying is the action it represents? Also, use clear patterns to deter actions. We often hear alarms and buzzers in games, and it's important to keep the aesthetic of the error sounds separate from regular notifications. Finally, to top it off, balance voice actors and screen readers, using the voice actors for story content and screen readers for dry information, and places where the speed of the screen reader would actually give the player an advantage. Other things to consider is when it comes to user testing. So user testing, accessibility needs to be informed by gamers who are blind and not by blindfolded developers. So just because you put one on your face and you can't see, that does not make you a blind gamer. They also need to be tested by these player setups and backed by real research. So like I said, try to do testing in person. Also, accessibility is an iterative process. It evolves with games. So what works for one game may not work for another. Also, consider the accessibility of consoles in stores like Steam, and development tools like Unity and Unreal, and even your own, and especially I would say, your own website. You must look at the full experience for gamers with visual impairments. And luckily, when it comes to user testing, there are gamers out there who would love to lend their experiences. Able Gamers now has player panels, which connect developers with gamers with disabilities. There's also the Accessibility User Research Collective. And there are people on audiogames.net who would love to share their thoughts with you. You could even go to organizations that are dedicated to the rights of people with disabilities. And finally, look at other projects outside of games, like the Guide Dogs app by Microsoft, which helps people navigate around their cities. Developers like Interactivity LLC are also making their music plugins for Reaper and Pro Tools blind accessible. And Zohar Gan has been working on a way to make VR experiences in Unreal Engine accessible for blind players. There's also Eben Sky Studios, who's creating a game-making software that is fully blind accessible. And finally, every October, there's a guy named James Kyle who runs an audio game jam that encourages others to make blind accessible games. And just to reiterate some of the resources that I use in this talk, I will have everything up on my website, smashclay.com/resources. Also, be sure to go to brandoncole.net to read his stories, and go to audiogames.net to see Tomas's list of accessible games. And be sure to read Sightless's report for his fellowship with the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. It is quite lengthy and it is in depth. He really covers everything. And while there are several podcasts that are dedicated to accessibility, one episode that I recommend is an interview with Joseph Bine from Outside Games with Ken Gagney from Polygamer. He will give you so much more insight than I could ever give. So I'd like to thank Audiokinetic for inviting me to come speak, and I thank everybody here for coming seeing my talk, and luckily we have time for questions.